There are words that do not draw blood. They simply reach inside you, find the most carefully tended part of your heart, and reduce it to ash without leaving a single visible mark. Mireia learned this on the coldest night of the year. The great lodge of Ashenvail blazed with firelight and noise. Every torch bracket along its stone walls burned at full strength, and the warmth pouring from the open doors carried the scent of cedar smoke, roasted meat, and the electric charge that gathered in the air when the pack assembled in force. The autumn convergence brought together every bloodline in the territory, from the Highland clans who descended from the northern ridgelines to the river wolves who rarely left their marshland borders. It happened once a year. It mattered enormously. Mireia had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing for it. She had pressed her dark green dress herself, smoothing every crease with careful hands. She had pinned her copper-brown hair into the simple style that Soren once told her made her look like she belonged to the old world, to the time before politics and pack councils and the endless, exhausting performance of power. She had practiced what she intended to say to him tonight, the words she had been carrying for 3 weeks like something made of glass, terrified of dropping them. Tonight, she had decided. Tonight, she would tell him. She crossed the outer courtyard with her heart beating faster than the occasion warranted, nodding to the guards who recognized her and waving to the kitchen women who called her name. She had served in this lodge for 2 years. She knew every corridor, every side door, and every place where the stone floors dipped from centuries of footsteps. She was comfortable here, in a way she had never been comfortable anywhere before. That comfort was about to become the cruelest irony of her life. She heard his voice before she reached the inner hall. Soren's voice was not a thing you missed in a crowd. It was low and unhurried, carrying the weight of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed. It moved through walls, it cut through noise, and on this night, it cut through Mireia so cleanly she did not even feel it at first. She stopped just outside the entrance to the council antechamber, her hand half raised to push open the heavy door. The voices inside were not performing for an audience. They were speaking the way men speak when they believe no one outside their circle can hear. The girl has been seen entering your private quarters 3 times this past moon cycle. That voice belonged to Lord Corvin of the Eastern Reaches, his tone carrying the smooth precision of a man making his case before a verdict. The council finds this troubling. It suggests an attachment that could complicate the alliances we are working to secure. A pause. Long enough that Mireia held her breath. You are referring to Mireia? Soren's voice, flat, unreadable. I am referring to the servant girl, yes, the one with no bloodline, no pack standing, and healing gifts she has clearly been concealing. The Eastern clans will not negotiate with an alpha whose judgment is compromised by sentiment. Particularly sentiment directed at someone so entirely beneath his station. Another silence. Mireia's hand pressed flat against the cold stone wall beside the door. Her fingers had gone numb. She told herself to move. She told herself that whatever came next, she did not need to hear it. She did not move. Let me be perfectly clear. Soren's voice, when it came, was steady as granite. It carried no trace of the man who had pressed his lips to her temple 2 weeks ago and told her that she was the only quiet thing in his loud and relentless world. She is nothing to me, a servant, nothing more. Whatever the council believes it has observed, I assure you, there is no attachment to complicate. The room beyond the door erupted in murmurs of approval. Mireia heard none of it. She was already walking. Her feet carried her backward, away from the door, away from the light and the warmth and the life she had been building inside this lodge, without ever fully admitting to herself that she was building it. Her green dress whispered against the stone floor. The noise of the convergent celebration pressed against her from every direction, cheerful and oblivious. She reached the outer courtyard. The cold hit her like a hand pressed flat against her chest. She stood very still in the dark and the frost and let the words settle all the way down through her until they reached the bottom. She is nothing to me. Nothing. Mireia pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. She would not make a sound. She would not give this night the dignity of her tears. She had survived her mother's death at 9 years old, had survived 3 winters alone in the borderlands before she found her way to Ashenvail, had survived the long, careful work of making herself invisible in a world that valued bloodlines above everything else. She could survive this, but even as she steadied herself, even as she drew the cold air into her lungs and told herself to be sensible and practical and unmoved, something deep inside her chest gave way. Not loudly, not with the shattering drama of something breaking. Quietly. The way the last timber of a burned building finally surrenders to gravity and falls. She did not see the figure watching from the shadow of the eastern archway. She did not notice the amber eyes that tracked her from the courtyard toward the servant's wing with an expression that was not cold at all. She did not hear those eyes close briefly, as if in pain. She only knew that she had to reach her room before the full weight of it caught up with her. The room Mireia had occupied for 2 years was small, but hers. She had made it hers deliberately, the way people who have lived without permanence learn to plant small flags of belonging wherever they can. A bundle of dried lavender hung above the window. A cracked clay bowl held smooth river stones from the valley below the lodge. A folded cloth on the shelf concealed the only thing of value she possessed, her grandmother's journal, its pages dense with remedies, and the careful handwritten observations of a woman who had understood the world in ways that still humbled her. Mireia sat on the edge of her narrow bed and placed both hands flat on her knees. She was not crying. She had made herself a promise in the courtyard, and she intended to keep it. The thing about surviving was that sentiment and strategy could not occupy the same space at the same time. Sentiment said, curl into yourself and grieve. Strategy said, look at what you know and decide what comes next. What she knew was this. She carried a secret that changed everything. 4 weeks ago, she had confirmed what she had been quietly suspecting for 6. She was carrying Soren's child. She had run the remedies herself, had used every diagnostic method her grandmother's journal described, had checked and rechecked the results with the meticulous precision her gift for healing demanded. There was no error, no possibility of misreading the signs. She had been preparing herself to tell him. That was why she had come to the lodge tonight dressed in her best dress with her practiced words and her terrified, hopeful heart. She is nothing to me. Mireia stood up. She crossed to the small chest beneath her window and opened it. Her hands moved without trembling, which surprised her. She folded 2 dresses, her warmest underthings, the thick wool stockings, and her traveling boots. She wrapped her grandmother's journal in oilcloth, tucked it into her pack alongside her medicines, her concentrated tinctures, the small folding knife, and the coins she had saved. Not many, but enough to get her somewhere. She did not take anything that was not already hers. She stood in the center of her small room and let herself look at it one last time. 2 years. She had been so careful, so disciplined. She had told herself 100 times that what grew between her and Soren was not wise, was not safe, and was not the kind of thing a woman in her position could afford to nurture. She had told herself these things and then gone to him anyway, every time, drawn by something she could not explain with any language she possessed. She pressed her hand to her abdomen, the gentlest, briefest pressure. I am sorry, she whispered. I did not plan this, but I will protect you. I swear that to you now. She pulled on her traveling cloak, shouldered her pack, and took the dried lavender from above the window because it had belonged to her mother, and she refused to leave it behind. She extinguished her lamp. The servants' corridor was empty. The celebration in the Great Lodge was loud enough to cover the sound of her footsteps as she moved toward the back gate, the one that opened onto the forest road without passing through the main courtyard. She was nearly there when old Petra stepped out of the linen room and stopped at the sight of her. The old woman was the closest thing to a friend Mireia had made in 2 years of careful distance. She had brought Mireia soup when she was ill, had covered her duties twice without being asked, had looked at Mireia sometimes with eyes that saw more than Mireia had intended to show. Petra looked at the pack on Mireia's shoulder, at her traveling cloak, at her face. She said nothing. Mireia said nothing. After a long moment, Petra stepped back into the linen room and pulled the door almost shut. Through the narrow gap, Mireia could see the old woman facing the shelves, her back deliberately turned. Mireia felt the grief of that small kindness hit her harder than anything else had that night. She pushed through the back gate and into the dark. Behind her, the lodge glowed with firelight and the sound of celebration. Somewhere inside it, the pack of Ashenvail was assembled in full, their alpha standing among them, calling her nothing. Mireia walked into the forest and did not look back. She did not see the back gate open a second time, minutes later. She did not see the figure who stood in the doorway, searching the darkness with desperate amber eyes, arriving too late to see which direction she had gone. The village of Dunhollow had a way of absorbing newcomers without making much fuss about it. This suited Mireia perfectly. She had arrived on a pale morning in late autumn, wet through from 2 days of rain, with a pack on her back and a story prepared. A widow, she told the innkeeper, who assessed her with the efficient eye of a woman who had seen hard luck walk through her door many times before. Her husband had been a tradesman. He had died of a fever. She had healing skills and was willing to work for room and board. Her name, she said, was Wren. Within a week, Mireia had delivered a difficult baby for the miller's wife and set 3 broken fingers for the blacksmith's youngest son. Within 2 weeks, Dunhollow had simply accepted that there was a healer woman now, and healer women were useful, and useful people were welcome. 3 months passed. Winter settled over Dunhollow with the quiet determination of a season that intends to stay. Mireia settled with it, learning the rhythms of the village quietly and thoroughly until she could navigate them with her eyes closed. She knew which families had trouble sleeping. She knew which old men's joints predicted snow better than any sky reading. She knew the widow Castara left herb bundles on her doorstep every 10th day as wordless gratitude for the pain remedy that finally let her sleep through the night. She had made herself useful. She had made herself small. She had made herself, as much as was possible, invisible. It was not enough to stop the ache. She had believed, in the first terrible weeks after she left Ashenvail, that the bond would fade. She had no formal claim. They had exchanged no public words. Nothing had been sealed in any way the pack would recognize. Whatever had grown between her and Soren had been a private thing, a whispered thing, and a thing that apparently meant nothing to him at all. It should have died quietly in the dark when she walked away. Instead, it burned. The mark on the inside of her left wrist, the one she kept covered beneath her sleeve at all times, had appeared 3 days after she left. She had woken from a restless sleep to find it there, a faint silver tracery just below the skin, shaped like nothing she could name, and pulsing with a warmth that had no right to be warm. She stared at it for a long time in the pale dawn light of the stable room. She was a healer. She understood the body's signals in ways most people did not. She understood exactly what this mark meant among wolf kind, what it indicated about the nature of what had been growing between her and Soren, without either of them putting a name to it. The knowledge had not comforted her. She kept it covered. She did not speak of it. She watched it with wary eyes in the mornings when she changed her bandaging, half expecting it to be gone, never finding it diminished. The child grew steadily, and the midwife Halsa, A practical woman of 60 who had delivered most of Dunhollow's population currently under the age of 30, had commented at Mireya's last examination that the baby was sitting high and wide in a way she had only seen when there was more than one. Mireya had said nothing to that. She had smiled, thanked Halsa, and walked home through the snow with her hand pressed to her belly and her mind carefully blank. She tried not to think about Soren. She failed, consistently and completely, every single night. The worst of it was not the anger. The anger was at least clean, at least useful, something she could hold in her hands and direct outward. The worst of it was the occasional moment, arriving without warning in the middle of ordinary tasks, when she would feel something through the mark on her wrist. Not pain, not heat, exactly. Something more like the sensation of someone in a distant room calling a name that was almost yours, just barely too far away to be certain. She had decided, firmly and repeatedly, that this was her imagination. On a morning in late winter, she was grinding dried yarrow root at her small workbench when the butcher's boy knocked at her door with the breathless energy of someone carrying news he considered enormously important. His name was Pell, and he was 12 years old and had decided some weeks ago that the healer woman was the most interesting person in Dunhollow, a loyalty Mireya had earned by letting him assist with a minor surgery on his father's hunting dog and treating him afterward to a serious explanation of what each instrument was used for. "Traders came in from the North Road this morning," Pell announced, before she had fully opened the door. "They have news from Ashenvail." Mireya's hands went still on the doorframe. She kept her face perfectly neutral. She had practiced this. She was very good at it by now. "Is that so?" she said. Pell nodded. "They said the Alpha has lost his mind, that he has been tearing apart every village from the northern border to the coast searching for someone. He sent half his warriors south, the other half east, and rode out himself with a small group, and has not returned to the lodge in over a month." The mark on Mireya's wrist blazed with sudden heat beneath her sleeve. She pressed her arm against her side. "Searching for who?" she asked, and was proud of how steady her voice came out. Pell shrugged. "Nobody knows. They only know that whatever he is looking for, he has not found it, and that the longer it takes, the worse he gets." The boy hesitated. "They said some of the pack are frightened of him now, that his eyes have changed." Mireya exhaled slowly. "Also," Pell added, saving the most important detail for last, "one of the traders said a man came through the village at the crossroads 2 days ago, alone, asking about a woman traveling with a healer's pack, describing her." The cold arrived without warning, settling in Mireya's chest like something solid. "What did he look like?" she asked carefully. Pell considered. "Older. Pale hair at his temples, had the look of a warrior but was traveling without weapons showing, and his eyes were the color of good amber." Mireya closed her door. She leaned her back against it and pressed both palms to her belly and stared at the ceiling of her small borrowed cottage, while the winter wind moved through the gaps in the walls, and the mark on her wrist burned and would not stop. Someone from Ashenvail was asking questions 2 days' ride from Dunhollow. Soren was searching the entire territory. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath all the anger and the grief, and 3 months of careful survival, a small and treacherous voice was asking a question she had refused to consider until this moment. What if the words she had heard through that door had not been the whole truth? She pushed the thought away with both hands, but it came back. It always came back. Outside her window, the first thin light of a winter dawn was beginning to separate the sky from the tree line, and in the forest beyond the village edge, something moved between the bare oaks that was too large and too deliberate to be any animal Dunhollow had seen before. Mireya did not see it, but it saw her light. A wound you cannot show anyone is the loneliest kind. Mireya had become an expert at concealment. She kept her left wrist covered at all times, binding it each morning with a strip of pale linen before she dressed. She told Halsa it was an old sprain that ached in cold weather. She told Pell, who noticed everything, that she had burned herself on a cooking pot. She told no one the truth, which was that the mark beneath the bandaging had not faded in 3 months, but had instead deepened, the silver tracery growing more distinct with each passing week, as though the bond were inscribing itself more permanently into her skin the longer she tried to ignore it. She had read about true mate bonds in her grandmother's journal, those dense, careful pages written by a woman who had spent a lifetime documenting what the old wolves knew and the new generation was forgetting. A bond of that nature did not dissolve because one party walked away. It dissolved only through death or through a formal severing. And a formal severing required both parties to be present, both parties to consent, and a ritual that left marks of its own on the skin. None of those things had happened. The bond simply endured, patient and indifferent to her feelings about it. On good nights, it was a low, steady warmth she had almost learned to ignore, like a hearth fire in the next room. On bad nights, something would pull her upright in the dark with her heart hammering and the mark blazing white-hot against her wrist, and the overwhelming sense of a presence pressing against the edges of her consciousness. Not words, not images exactly, something more primitive than either. Not in language, but in raw, unfiltered feeling. Urgency, desperation. A searching so relentless it had worn itself into something that felt, if she was honest, like grief. She refused to interpret it. She refused to let it mean anything. But she lay awake for hours afterward, her hand pressed against her belly in the dark, feeling the twins shift and settle, wondering whether the searching she felt through the bond was as fruitless as she had told herself it was. The pregnancy had begun to show unmistakably. Halsa had confirmed what Mireia already suspected. 2 heartbeats, strong and steady, beating in the slightly offset rhythm of twins sharing a space not quite designed for 2. The midwife made the announcement with the satisfied air of a woman whose instincts had proven correct, and Mireia had thanked her with a smile that held until she was alone again. 2 children, both of them his. She thought about Soren least successfully at dawn, when the sky turned the dark gold color that had been his eyes in the firelight, and most successfully in the middle of the day, when she was occupied with the work that had always saved her, the grinding and mixing and measuring, the patient application of skill to suffering that she understood in her bones. She thought about his voice. Not the voice that had said those words through the council chamber door, but the other voice, the one that only existed when they were alone, lower and less defended. The voice that had once told her she had made him feel like more than the function he had spent 20 years becoming. She is nothing to me. Mireia pushed the memory down and focused on her yarrow. It was on a dim afternoon in the 4th month of her hiding that she became certain the forest was no longer empty. She was gathering wood from the stack behind her cottage when she felt it, a prickling awareness along the back of her neck that she had learned long ago to take seriously. She stood very still and let her other senses do what her eyes could not, and what they told her made the breath catch quietly in her throat. The pine trees at the far edge of the clearing were motionless in the windless air. Everything appeared exactly as it should, but her healing gift, which had always extended slightly beyond the purely physical into a sensitivity to living things she had never been able to fully explain, was telling her with absolute certainty that something was watching. Something large. Something that knew exactly how to hold still. She went back inside and watched the tree line until the light failed. She saw nothing. But when she went to her door just before she bolted it for the night, she found a single gray feather on her threshold that had not been there that morning, not placed carelessly, laid with deliberate precision in the center of the step, the quill pointing toward her door. Mireia stared at it for a long time in the last dim light. Then she bolted the door, checked every window latch, and lay awake all night with the silver knife her grandmother had left her held loosely in one hand and the mark on her wrist burning steadily, like a lantern someone had lit to guide a traveler home. The traders who came through Dunhollow that winter were a rougher, more weathered group than the autumn merchants, men and women who moved the territory's back routes rather than its main roads, which meant they carried news the official channels had not yet sanitized. Mireia heard most of it secondhand, through Pell, who arrived on her doorstep 3 mornings running with new information, each installment more unsettling than the last. On the first morning, he told her that the Autumn Convergence Alliance negotiations had collapsed entirely. Lord Corvin of the Eastern Reaches had withdrawn his delegation from Ashenvail without explanation, taking his warriors and his trade agreements with him. The Pack Council was fractured. Several of the lesser bloodline representatives had followed Corvin's lead, declaring that they could not negotiate with an alpha whose behavior had become, in the words, one elder apparently used within earshot of a traveling merchant, dangerously unpredictable. Mireia ground her herbs and said nothing. On the second morning, Pell told her that Corvin had proposed his daughter Celadine as a candidate for the Alpha's bonded mate, framing it as a solution to the instability that had gripped Ashenvail since autumn. The Pack Council had reportedly received this proposal with significant interest. Soren had refused it. Not diplomatically. Not with the careful political language Mireia knew was the expected currency of such negotiations. He had refused it in terms that had apparently left the intermediary pale and shaking and extremely eager to deliver the message from a distance. Mireia set down her pestle and stood at her workbench for a moment, very still. "That is interesting," she said, and resumed grinding. On the third morning, Pell arrived earlier than usual, slightly out of breath, and told her that one of the traders had spoken with a woman from a village 2 days north of Dunhollow, a woman who reported that a group of wolves in shifted form had passed through the surrounding forest 4 nights ago, moving south, moving fast, moving in the organized formation of a search party rather than a traveling pack. They were not wild, Pell said carefully, because he was a perceptive child who had clearly been thinking about how to say this. The woman said their eyes had intention in them. Mireia looked at him steadily. "Thank your father for the fire logs he left at my gate." Pell hesitated. Then, with a peculiar delicacy that occasionally surfaced through his 12-year-old enthusiasm, he asked, "Are you in trouble, Wren?" "No," Mireia said. This was not entirely true, but it was the answer that would keep him from doing anything brave and foolish, which was the answer she needed to give. After he left, she sat in her chair for a long time. She thought about what she knew, laid out plainly without the distortion of feeling. Soren had refused Celadine, the match that would have resolved his political crisis most efficiently. He had been searching the territory for months with the kind of thoroughness a man applies only to something that genuinely matters, none of which was the behavior of a man who had meant it when he said she was nothing, or whispered the part of her that she most wanted to silence, none of which was the behavior of a man who had said those words freely. She pressed that thought down very hard, and then the knock came at her door, and everything changed. The man on her threshold was not Pell. He was somewhere past 50, solid and straight-backed in the way of someone who had spent decades in physical discipline, his dark hair cut close to his head and threaded through with iron gray. He was dressed plainly, in a traveler's coat with no visible insignia, but his posture was the kind that could not be entirely concealed by ordinary clothing. He carried himself like a man accustomed to standing between the person he served and whatever came at them. His eyes were calm and direct, and very tired. "Mistress Wren," he said, in a voice that made it clear he knew perfectly well this was not her name. Mireia kept her hand on the door frame and her face neutral. "I am not expecting anyone." "No," the man said quietly. "You would not be. My name is Oswin. I am first beta to the Alpha of Ashenvail." He paused, and something in his expression shifted to something that looked almost like relief at finally being able to say words he had been carrying a long distance. I have been searching for you for 6 weeks, my lady, and I have come alone because what I need to tell you is not something that should have witnesses. The mark on Mireille's wrist flared with sudden fierce heat. The twins moved simultaneously. You may come in, she said, but understand that I am a woman alone in a strange village, and the knife I keep beside my door is not decorative. The corner of Oswin's mouth shifted in a way that might, under different circumstances, have been a smile. He stepped inside. Oswin sat at her small table and accepted the cup of tea she gave him with both hands, the gesture of a man who understood the significance of being offered something in a home where he was not expected and not entirely trusted. He did not speak immediately. He looked at her with those tired, careful eyes, arranging what he needed to say in the order most likely to be heard, rather than simply the order in which it had occurred. Before I say anything else, he began, I need you to understand that I am not here representing the Pack Council. I am here because I have served Soren since he was 17 years old, and I have watched him become something in the past 4 months that I do not recognize, and I believe you are the only person alive who can prevent what he is becoming from being permanent. Mireille said nothing. She held her tea and waited. He said those words, Oswin said. I will not pretend he did not. You heard them. They were said. But what you did not hear, because you left before it was finished, was why. Something cold and careful settled in Mireille's chest. Tell me, she said. Oswin set down his cup. The evening before the convergence, Corvin came to Soren privately, not as a pack elder. He came with information. Oswin's jaw tightened. Corvin had spent the previous month conducting his own investigation into you, your origins, your gift, where it came from. Mireille's hands went still around her cup. Your grandmother, Oswin said quietly, was not simply a village herbalist. The silence in the cottage became a different kind of silence entirely. What Corvin had discovered was that your grandmother carried the bloodline of the Ashenkin, the old wolves, the ones who were hunted out of the territory 3 generations ago, when the founding pack decided that any wolf with elemental gifts was a threat to the established order. He looked at her steadily. Under the laws that Corvin cited chapter and verse to our alpha, any descendant of the Ashenkin found living within pack territory without declaration is subject to immediate exile, or worse. The provisions are old and brutal, and Corvin knew exactly which elders on the council would enforce them without hesitation. Mireille set down her tea. She did it very carefully because she did not trust her hands. He gave Soren a choice, Oswin said. Publicly sever all association with you that night before the council witnesses he had conveniently assembled in the antechamber, or Corvin would bring the matter before the full pack the following morning with enough documentation to have you removed by force. Oswin's voice was even, and she could hear the effort that evenness cost him. He told Soren that if the association was cleanly severed, he would destroy his documentation and the matter would end. That you would be safe, that no one would touch you. The mark on Mireille's wrist blazed so intensely the linen bandaging felt inadequate. He said those words, she heard herself say, slowly, as if learning a language, to protect me. He said those words believing you were not in the building. He was told you were in the kitchens with the evening staff. He had no idea you had come to find him. Oswin looked at her with something that lived between pity and sorrow. He came to your room 3 minutes after the council dismissed. He was 3 minutes too late. Mireille stood. She crossed to the window without being entirely aware of deciding to move, and stood looking out at the bare winter fields while everything she had built the past 4 months on rearranged itself into a completely different shape. He had not meant it. He had said the worst thing he could have said, in the worst possible way, and she had heard it in the worst possible context, and it had destroyed them both. And the reason he had said it was to keep her safe. The grief that moved through her in that moment was not the old grief she had been carrying. It was something new, made of too many things at once. Fury and sorrow and a relief so complicated it felt nothing like relief. "There is more," Oswin said from behind her. She turned. He had drawn something from inside his coat. A folded paper, sealed with dark wax bearing a crest she did not recognize, though the serpentine design resonated unpleasantly. "Corvin did not destroy his documentation," Oswin said. "He never intended to. What he intended was to use the severing as the first move in a much longer game. With Soren isolated from his true mate, the path to installing Celadine as a political bondmate and gradually transferring pack authority to the eastern reaches would be significantly shorter." His tone did not change. "3 weeks ago, one of my wolves intercepted a courier traveling the southern road. This letter was in his possession." Mireia took the paper. The message inside was brief and written in a careful hand. "The complication has been located in the south, Dunhollow, a day's ride from the river crossing. Handle it before the spring thaw. Ensure it appears accidental. The Alpha must have no reason to continue searching. The complication." Mireia read the words twice. Then she folded the paper and set it on her table with the deliberate care of a person managing the distance between themselves and something dangerous. "How long ago was this intercepted?" she asked. 12 days, Oswin said. 12 days. A day's ride, the gray feather on her doorstep, the thing she had felt watching from the tree line. "They are already here," she said. Oswin rose from his chair, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "That is why I came alone. A larger group would have drawn attention. What I have waiting in the forest at the edge of this village is small, but capable." His voice shifted to something very direct. "Soren is a day's hard ride behind me. He felt the bond strengthen 2 weeks ago, and knows he is moving in the right direction. He does not know exactly where you are, but he is pushing hard, and nothing I said would slow him." Mireia looked at him. "He does not know about the children," she said. Oswin met her eyes. "No." Outside, the winter afternoon had gone very still. The stillness Mireia had learned, in a childhood spent moving between wild places, to recognize. Not peace. Its opposite. The stillness of things that were about to move. From somewhere in the village, far too close, she heard a dog begin to bark and then go abruptly, unnaturally silent. Oswin's hand closed around his knife. "They are not waiting for dark," he said. The dog did not bark again. Sudden silence from a watchdog meant one of two things. Either the animal had been reassured by something it recognized, or it had been silenced by something it feared. Oswin was already moving toward the window, keeping low beneath the sill, his knife drawn and held with practiced ease. "How many do you have in the forest?" Mireia asked, and was grateful for how calm her voice came out. 4, Oswin said. "Good wolves, but we do not know how many Corvin sent." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "Is there a back way out of this cottage?" "The root cellar has a tunnel that opens 50 yards into the eastern tree line." She had always made a habit of knowing her exits. "But if they have wolves in shifted forms circling the village, the tunnel will not be enough." "No," Oswin agreed. "It will not." He moved toward the front door and then stopped, one hand raised. Mireia heard it too. Footsteps. More than one pair, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of people who did not believe their target had anywhere to go. Then the front window exploded inward. Mireia was already moving, throwing herself sideways as a crossbow bolt punched through the space she had been occupying and buried itself in the far wall. The twins lurched within her, and she caught herself against the workbench, scattering jars and instruments across the floor. Oswin went through the door rather than opening it, his shoulder taking the wood off its hinges as he shifted mid-stride. his human form dissolving into the large gray wolf that landed in the snow outside with its head already swinging to track the nearest threat. Mireia scrambled toward the hearth and seized the iron poker. Through the ruined window she could see shapes moving in the last daylight. 3 dark-coated wolves circling the cottage with the coordinated precision of trained hunters. Oswin's wolf met the nearest one head-on, the impact sending both animals rolling. A figure stepped through the destroyed window frame. He was lean and deliberate, dressed in muted gray that blended with the twilight, and he moved through her wrecked cottage like a man who had already decided it belonged to him. His face was angled and patient, the face of someone who did his work methodically and without unnecessary feeling. He looked at Mireia. He looked at the obvious curve of her belly beneath her dress. He looked at the iron poker in her hands. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said pleasantly. "I do that," Mireia said. He reached into his coat. The sound from outside stopped her from finding out what he was reaching for. Not a howl, exactly. More like a concussion of air, the sound of something moving through the forest at a speed the ear could barely process, accompanied by a wave of pressure that rattled the remaining window glass in its frame. The man in gray froze. Something enormous came through the wall. Not through the door. Not through the window. Through the wall itself, the ancient timber splitting and giving way as a wolf the color of deep winter night landed in the center of the cottage in a cascade of broken wood and plaster dust. It was vast, its black fur standing along its spine and its eyes blazing with a gold so intense it threw actual light across the ruined interior. It placed itself between Mireia and the man in gray with the absolute territorial certainty of something that had decided this was the last place on earth this person would ever threaten anyone. The man in gray looked at those burning eyes for approximately 3 seconds. Then he went back through the window considerably faster than he had come in. The great black wolf turned. Mireia stood in the wreckage of her cottage with her iron poker in her hand and her heart doing something she was not prepared to name, and she looked at those gold eyes from a distance of 4 feet. And she knew. She had always known what color his eyes were. The shift happened in a cascade of light and shadow, and then Soren stood in her destroyed cottage, his chest heaving, his dark hair wild, and his eyes still blazing the same impossible gold. He was thinner than she remembered. The lines of his face had sharpened, and there were shadows beneath his eyes that had not been there 4 months ago. He stared at her. His gaze moved from her face to the hand still clutching the poker to the undeniable evidence of the twins, and then back to her face. His throat moved. "Mireia," he said, and the way he said it made it clear that the word had been living in his mouth for months, like something he did not know how to put down. From outside, the sounds of battle were diminishing. Oswin's wolves had turned the tide. But there were still enemies in the village of Dunhollow, and the worst of them was not here. The reunion she had imagined in the darkest hours of her exile had never looked like this. She had imagined it in fragments, against her will, the way the mind insists on rehearsing things you have told it firmly to leave alone. She had imagined coldness, a clean and final confrontation, brief and definitive. She had not imagined standing in the wreckage of her borrowed home with her iron poker still in her hand and months of grief pressing against the inside of her chest, looking for any available exit. She had not imagined how it would feel to see him diminished. That was the word that kept arriving, unwanted and accurate. Diminished. He was still physically the same, still the largest man she had ever known, still carrying that quality of concentrated force that had always made the air feel different in whatever room he occupied. But something in him had been worn down by the months, the way a stone is worn by water, and the evidence of it was in every line of his face, and the desperate, careful way he was looking at her, as if she might dissolve if he moved too quickly. "You should not be here," she said. "I know," Soren said. "It is not safe. They sent assassins." Corvin knows where I am. I know that too. He took one step toward her. Just one. Oswin's wolves found me at the tree line an hour ago and told me everything. I have been riding hard for days to close the distance. His jaw tightened. I have been behind everything since the night you left. Outside, the last sounds of conflict faded into silence. Oswin's voice rose briefly, giving quiet orders, and then there was the stillness that follows a fight that has been won but not without cost. Mireia set down the poker. "There are injured," she said, and moved toward the door, because that was something she knew how to do, and the alternative was standing in the ruin of her cottage being looked at with those terrible gold eyes. Soren caught her wrist gently as she passed. Not the wrist with the mark. The other one. The touch was light enough that she could have pulled free without effort. She did not pull free. "They can wait 2 minutes," he said. "Please." She stopped. She did not turn to face him. "I know what you heard," Soren said. His voice was low and stripped of everything except the plain fact of what he needed to say. "I know what it must have sounded like. I know there is nothing I can offer as justification, because there is no justification for the way those words must have landed. But I need you to know that I said them believing you were not in the building, that I said them because I believed it was the only way to keep you alive, and that the moment Corvin left that room, I went to find you, to tell you the truth, to ask whether you could forgive me for the choice I made without consulting you." He stopped. "Your room was empty. Your lavender was gone from the window, and I understood in about 30 seconds exactly what had happened." Mireia said nothing. "I have been running toward you ever since," Soren said quietly. "Never fast enough. I am sorry, Mireia, for the words, for the choice I made without you, for every day of these past months that you spent believing I had discarded you." She turned then because she had to. He was close, closer than she had fully registered, and he was looking at her with an expression that had no armor in it at all, which was the thing about him she had always found most difficult to defend against. He had never been someone who hid behind the role, not with her. "You made that choice," she said, her voice steady because she had been practicing steadiness for months, "to protect me, without asking whether I wanted to be protected that way, without trusting me with the truth. Yes. That is not something I can simply set aside. I know. I am also carrying your children in a borrowed cottage in a village where people just tried to kill me," she said, "so we are going to have to set it aside temporarily and discuss it properly later. But I want you to understand that later is coming." Something shifted in Soren's face, something that was not quite relief, and was considerably more complicated. Then his eyes dropped to her belly and stayed there, and the expression that moved through him was one she had no word for at all. "Children," he said softly. "Plural." "2," Mireia confirmed. "Your first beta has known for approximately 2 hours. I trust you are not offended to be the last to find out." The sound Soren made was somewhere between a laugh and something that was not a laugh at all. He reached out very slowly, giving her every opportunity to refuse, and placed his palm against the curve where his children lived. The twins moved immediately, both of them shifting toward the warmth of his hand like plants turning toward light. Soren closed his eyes. The mark on Mireia's wrist blazed with a warmth that was nothing like pain. It lasted 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then Oswin appeared in the destroyed doorway with blood on his coat and an expression of controlled urgency that immediately collapsed the moment back into its practical dimensions. "My lord," Oswin said. "Corvin came himself. He arrived in the village during the fight. He has taken hostages from the inn. He is demanding you present yourself to him before moonrise, or he will begin executing them." A pause waited with everything he did not want to say next. "He has Pell, and Halsa, and 6 others." Mireia went very still. Then she reached past Soren for her traveling cloak. "Tell me where the inn is," Soren said to Oswin, already moving toward the door. "No," Mireia said. Both men looked at her. "If you walk in there with your wolves," she said with perfect clarity, "Corvin will execute those people before you reach the door. He has nothing to lose now. He came here personally, which means he has already decided he is past negotiation." She pulled the cloak around her shoulders. "But I am what he came for. I am the leverage he has always been using. If I walk in alone, he will want to keep me alive long enough to use me. That gives us time." Soren's expression was controlled in the way of someone exerting tremendous effort to keep it that way. "I am not sending you in there alone." "You are not sending me anywhere," Mireia said quietly. "I am choosing to go. There is a difference, and I need you to understand it." The Ashenkin blood her grandmother had left her was awake in a way it had never fully been before, aware of every living thing within a quarter mile, the terrified heartbeats of the hostages in the inn, the cold, calculated breathing of Corvin and his remaining men, the vast dark forest pressing against the edges of the village with its own slow, ancient awareness. She had hidden this her entire life. She was done hiding. "Trust me," she said to Soren, "and keep your wolves in the forest until I give you a reason to move." She walked out into the winter dark before he could find the words to stop her. The inn at the center of Dunhollow was a low, long building that smelled permanently of wood smoke and boiled grain, a smell Mireia had come to associate, over these months, with the comfort of ordinary life going about its ordinary business. She pushed open the door and went inside. The scene within was orderly in the way that scenes arranged by someone who wants to demonstrate control are orderly. 8 hostages sat against the far wall, their wrists bound with rough cord. Pell was among them, white-faced and rigid, his 12-year-old dignity holding by a thread. Old Halsa had her chin up and her eyes flat, with the contempt of a woman who has spent 60 years dealing with difficult situations and has formed her opinions about human nature accordingly. 3 of Corvin's men stood at intervals around the room, armed and positioned with professional placement. And at the head of the long table, with his hands folded before him and his silver hair catching the lamplight, sat Lord Corvin of the Eastern Reaches. He looked, Mireia thought, like a man who had expected to wait longer. "The healer woman," he said, "or whatever you are actually calling yourself these days." "My name is Mireia," she said. "I stopped hiding it about an hour ago." Corvin studied her with the evaluative expression of someone running calculations. "You came alone." "I came to ask you to release these people. They have nothing to do with whatever exists between you and the Alpha of Ashenvail." "Everything is connected," Corvin said pleasantly. "That is the first principle of strategy. You are connected to Soren. Soren is connected to the pack leadership my family has been owed for 3 generations and denied through treachery." His tone remained conversational, which was worse than anger would have been. "My grandfather was passed over for the Alpha position in favor of Soren's grandfather, on the basis of a bloodline dispute that was never fairly adjudicated. Everything I have built since then has been aimed at correcting that original wrong. So you decided the correction should involve destroying a young woman's reputation and sending assassins after her while she was pregnant," Mireia said. Corvin's expression did not change. "I decided to remove an obstacle. You were never meant to be anything more than a passing attachment. When it became clear you were something more permanent, you became a problem that required solving. The Ashenkin blood was a gift, a legal mechanism. I had hoped Soren would accept the situation gracefully. He did not. No." A flicker of something moved behind Corvin's eyes, the first genuine emotion she had seen in them. "He did not. Which tells me that a true mate bond supersedes political convenience. I miscalculated." "You made several miscalculations," Mireia said. She was aware, through the mark on her wrist, of Soren at the edge of the village, his restraint costing him visibly even from this distance. She was also aware of something else. The inn was a living structure. 200 years old, its timbers grown from the same forest that pressed against Dunhollow's edges. The wood still remembered what it had been. Deep in the grain of the floor beneath her feet, deep in the ancient beams above her head, something resonated with the Ashenkin gift that had been waking in her for months. She pressed her awareness into it, gently. It answered. "Release them," she said to Corvin. "I will come with you willingly. I will not resist whatever legal proceeding you intend to bring regarding my bloodline, but release these people. They are not part of this." Corvin appeared to consider this. "And the Alpha?" "Is waiting in the forest. You knew he would be." She held Corvin's gaze steadily. "You came here personally because you wanted to negotiate. If you had only wanted me dead, your assassins would have been sufficient. You came because you want something from Soren that killing me would make impossible." A silence fell over the inn. Pell was staring at her with wide dark eyes. Corvin's mouth curved slightly. "Intelligent. Yes. I came because I want what I have always wanted. Formal recognition of the bloodline claim my grandfather was denied, a seat on the ruling council with veto authority, and a binding agreement that Celadine will be recognized as an alpha mate candidate for the next generation." "That is not your decision to make," Soren's voice said from the doorway. He stepped inside, and the temperature in the room changed the way it changes when something large and dangerous arrives, and everyone present recalibrates their understanding of the situation. Corvin's men moved toward their weapons. "No," Soren said. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. "The next person in this room who reaches for anything edged will spend the rest of a very short life regretting it." His eyes moved to Mireia first, a single sweep that assessed her and the twins, and the space between her and Corvin's nearest guard, and then settled on Corvin with the focused attention of a man who has arrived at the end of a very long patience. "My lord," Corvin said carefully, "you are one man and I have—" The walls of the inn moved, not catastrophically, not destructively, but every timber in the structure shuddered simultaneously with a low, resonant vibration that was absolutely unmistakable and absolutely impossible. And from the floor beneath every one of Corvin's 3 guards, roots pushed up through the ancient floorboards and wrapped around their ankles with the quiet, deliberate certainty of something that has always been there and has simply decided, at last, to become visible. The guards looked down at their feet in complete silence. Mireia stood in the center of the room with her hands open at her sides, and the golden light of the Ashenkin gift moving across her skin. And she looked at Corvin across the long table and she said, very quietly, "Release them. Now." Corvin looked at his immobilized guards. He looked at Soren in the doorway. He looked at Mireia, at the light moving across her hands, at the absolute steadiness of a woman who has spent months being afraid and has decided quite deliberately to stop. He reached forward and cut Pell's wrist bindings himself. One by one, the hostages were freed. They moved toward the door in a clustered rush, Halsa pausing as she passed Mireia to squeeze her hand once with fierce brevity before shepherding the others out into the night. Pell stopped in the doorway. He looked at Mireia, at the light still fading from her skin, at the roots wrapped around the guard's ankles. "I knew you were interesting," he said, with a conviction that was entirely sincere. Despite everything, Mireia almost smiled. Outside, Oswin's wolves moved into position, securing the perimeter. The Lord of the Eastern Reaches sat at the head of the long table with his hands still folded before him, his composure intact and his options gone. Soren turned to face him, and the look in those amber eyes was absolutely definitive. "You wanted recognition," Soren said. "You will have it. Every pack from the northern ridge to the coast will know the name of Corvin of the Eastern Reaches. They will know exactly what he attempted, exactly how it failed, and exactly what the Alpha of Ashenvail decided it was worth." Oswin stepped through the doorway holding the intercepted letter. Corvin's composure finally cracked. just slightly. Just enough. Outside, the wolves of Ashenvail began to howl. Dunhollow dealt with the aftermath of that evening with the practical efficiency of a community that has survived hard winters and knows how to close ranks around its own. The innkeeper set about boarding up her broken window. Halsa examined the injuries from the courtyard fight with professional thoroughness, pronouncing 3 of Oswin's wolves in need of proper attention and delivering this verdict directly to Oswin himself, with the kind of authority that bypassed entirely the question of whether he outranked her. Pell was sent home under strict instructions. He went with poor grace, looking back twice, the second time directly at Mireia with an expression that communicated very clearly that he intended to require a full explanation at the earliest opportunity. Corvin and his remaining men were bound and secured in the inn storeroom under Oswin's guard, to be transported to Ashenvail at first light. Soren found Mireia sitting on the low stone wall behind the ruins of her cottage, her cloak wrapped around her against the cold, her eyes on the dark line of the forest. He sat beside her. He did not speak immediately, which was something she had always appreciated about him. He understood the value of silence, the way it created a space that words could move into when they were ready rather than being forced. The night was clear and very cold, the winter stars sharp and indifferent overhead. Somewhere in the village, a fire had been lit. "I need to ask you something," Mireia said. "Ask." Through the bond, during the months, I felt something when I slept, a presence reaching for me. She kept her eyes on the forest. "Oswin told me the bond was never severed, that you were reaching for me through it when you slept." "Yes," Soren said. "Were the things you said in those moments real?" He turned to look at her. She felt it rather than saw it. The shift in his attention, as if the full weight of him was a thing you could feel on your skin. "Every word," he said. Mireia breathed. "Then I need you to say them again," she said. "Not through the bond, not in a dream. Here, now, while I am awake and standing in my own life." Soren was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man searching for words, but the silence of a man who has been carrying certain words for a long time and is deciding whether he finally has permission to put them down. "I love you," he said. The simplicity of it was devastating. "I have loved you since the 4th month of knowing you, when I realized I was rearranging the shape of my entire day to pass through whatever room you were likely to be in. I loved you through every week of this winter. I loved you while I was tearing apart the territory trying to find you. I am going to love you past the point where it is remotely convenient or politically straightforward, which I understand it never entirely will be, and I want you to understand that I consider this a completely acceptable situation." Mireia looked at him then. He looked back. "I am still angry with you," she said. "I know. You made a decision that was mine to make with you. You chose my safety without my consent, and it cost us these months, and nearly cost us considerably more. I know that too. If you ever," she said with quiet precision, "make a decision about my life without consulting me again, I will make the rest of yours extremely difficult." "Understood," Soren said, and the absolute sincerity in his voice was such that it could not coexist with anything except the truth. "I love you too," Mireia said. "I loved you while I was furious with you, which I found profoundly inconvenient. I loved you every night in this village while I was telling myself I had moved past it." She paused. "The children know your voice. They have known it since the moment you arrived in Dunhollow. They moved toward you before I had decided what I was going to do, which I think was extremely presumptuous of them." Soren made a sound she had only heard from him a handful of times, raw and genuine, and entirely unguarded. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. They sat on the cold stone wall in the dark with the ruined cottage behind them, and the forest ahead and the stars overhead, and the mark on Mireia's wrist burned with a warmth that was neither pain nor entirely comfortable, but felt, for the first time, exactly like what it was. A beginning that had survived everything they had thrown at it. After a long time, Soren spoke. "There is something else you need to know. Something I need to tell you before we go back to Ashenvail." She looked at him. "The morning before the convergence," he said carefully. "Before Corvin came to me that evening, I had the formal declaration papers drawn up. The ones required under pack law to recognize a true mate bond and announce an intended bondmate to the council." His jaw moved. "I was going to announce you that night, at the convergence, in front of every bloodline in the territory." The silence that followed this was a different kind of silence entirely. "I never got to tell you that," Soren said. "And then everything happened, and you were gone. And I spent all these months knowing that the thing I had planned to do, the thing that would have changed everything, was the one thing you would never know I had intended." He had been going to choose her, publicly, formally, before Corvin changed the shape of that night entirely. She had spent these months believing she was nothing to him. He had spent them knowing he had been on the verge of declaring her everything. The distance between those two realities was not something that resolved cleanly, but it was something she could carry differently now that she understood its full dimensions, and that was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a great deal. "You are going to have to be very patient with me," she said. "I have been practicing," Soren said quietly. She leaned against his shoulder. He went very still for a moment, the way he always had when she did something unexpectedly soft, that brief adjustment of a man who had not quite believed it was coming. Then his arm came around her, and the mark on her wrist pulsed once, deep and certain, like a door being opened after a long time locked. They stayed in Dunhollow for 3 days. Not by choice, exactly. Oswin made the case with the methodical precision of a man who has spent 30 years ensuring that the people he served survived their own impatience. The winter roads required preparation for a pregnant woman traveling with twins. The wolves needed to recover from their injuries, and Mireia, who had been running on adrenaline and suppressed Ashenkin power and the energy of a woman braced for the worst for so long that she forgot to account for what came after, sat down on the second morning and discovered that she was exhausted in a way that went straight to the bone. She slept for 14 hours. When she woke, Soren was sitting in the chair beside the bed, watching the door with the vigilance of a man who had spent months unable to protect something and was now applying himself to the task with complete dedication. "You do not need to watch the door," Mireia told him. "I am aware," he said. He did not stop watching it. She did not tell him to stop again. She understood, with the clarity of someone who had also spent months in a specific kind of sustained fear, that the watching was not about the door. Pell arrived on the second afternoon and was granted a formal audience in the common room, during which he asked Soren 11 questions about pack structure with the focused intensity of a young person who has discovered an interest and intends to pursue it comprehensively. Soren answered all 11 with complete seriousness, which elevated him considerably in Mireia's estimation. A person's character was most accurately revealed, not in how they treated those with power over them, but in how they treated a 12-year-old who was asking too many questions. On the evening before their departure, Mireia found Soren standing at the edge of the forest in the blue dusk, very still, his face turned toward the trees. She stood beside him and said nothing, the way he had always been willing to do for her. After a time, he said, "I have been trying to understand what it would feel like to do what you did. Leaving that night, finding a village, building a life from nothing in a place where no one knew your name, while carrying children and hiding a gift and feeling what you must have felt through the bond every single night." He shook his head, a small movement. "I cannot reach the full dimensions of it." "You were doing your own version of it," Mireia said. "I had my pack. I had the lodge, the territory, the work. I had things to do with the desperation. You had nothing except the village and the winters and whatever you could build with your hands. He turned to look at her. You are extraordinary. Not as a mate's bias, as an honest assessment. I was mostly just frightened, Mireia said. Frightened people who keep going anyway are the definition of extraordinary, Soren said simply. She looked at him for a long moment in the blue evening light. Then she reached up and unwrapped the linen strip from her wrist. The mark was luminous in the dimness, the silver tracery more elaborate than it had been even a week ago, as if the proximity of the bond's counterpart had accelerated whatever process the months of separation had begun. She held it up between them. Soren extended his own wrist. Beneath the skin, in the same precise location, she could see the answering silver, faint but unmistakable, the mirror of her own mark that had been waiting there since the bond first took hold between them. He ran his thumb across her mark, the gesture so gentle it was almost not a gesture at all. The bond is incomplete, she said. It has been wanting completion since the night it began. I have been keeping it at arm's length because I was afraid of what completing it would mean. She kept her eyes on their wrists. I am not afraid of it anymore. Soren was very still. I want to do this, she said. Not because of what the pact requires or what the law specifies. I want it because I have spent these months on the far side of this bond, and I am not interested in spending another day there. She looked up at him. If you want the same thing. I have wanted nothing else, Soren said, since the morning I realized I had been rearranging my day to walk through your room. She pressed her marked wrist to his, the way her grandmother's journal described, the ancient instinctive alignment that the Ashenkin had always understood. The bond completed with the absolute certainty of something that had been waiting. It was not pain, and it was not entirely pleasure. It was more like the sensation of a door opening that you had not known was closed, flooding the room with air and light after a long, airless confinement, and she felt Soren's essence pour through the opening the way the spring flood pours through a valley, vast and inevitable, and carrying everything with it. She saw herself as he had seen her the morning she walked into the lodge's healing room 2 years ago, with her grandmother's journal under her arm and her chin up, and her eyes taking rapid, careful inventory of her new surroundings. She felt the specific quality of attention he had been paying her since that morning, the kind of attention a person pays to something they have not yet admitted to themselves that they are paying attention to. She saw the night of the convergence through his memory. Not what she had observed from outside the door, but what had been happening inside him in the 20 seconds before he said those words. The calculation that felt like a trap, with no exit. The belief that he was trading his own happiness for her safety. The absolute certainty that he would find her afterward and explain everything. And he felt her exile. He felt the cold of the forest road and the weight of the pack on her back, and the single decision she had made not to look back, because she knew if she looked back, she would stop. He felt the months in Dunhollow, the work that saved her, and the nights that did not. The mark burning on her wrist while she told herself it meant nothing. When it was over, they stood in the blue evening outside the forest and looked at each other across a bond that had finally, at extraordinary cost, become what it had always been reaching toward. Soren pressed his forehead to hers. Always? She asked, because she needed to hear him say it clearly, without armor, in the ordinary evening air. Always, he said. In this life and every life the bond carries across. You are my home, Mireia, not the lodge, not Ashenvail, you. Spring came to Ashenvail with the extravagance of a season that knows it has been earned. The crops that had struggled through a winter of fractured leadership unfurled with remarkable vigor from the thawing ground. The wolves who had grown unsettled in the months of their alpha's distress settled back into themselves with the gradual ease of animals returning to their natural state. The trial of Lord Corvin of the Eastern Reaches was conducted before representatives of every allied bloodline in the territory, formal, thorough, and attended by the focused silence that falls when a room full of people understands that what is happening will be recorded and remembered. The evidence was extensive. Corvin conducted himself with the composed dignity of a man who had decided that dignity was the one thing he could still control. He accepted the verdict of permanent exile and the dissolution of his bloodline's eastern claims with the same stillness he had shown across the long table in Dunhollow. Celadine was stripped of her candidacy status and her family's council seat. She was not exiled. Soren had made that decision deliberately. A woman raised by Corvin's specific ambitions deserved the opportunity to demonstrate what she was capable of becoming without them. The Eastern Reaches needed governance. She understood their territory better than anyone else available. Mireia had told Soren quietly that she thought it was the right call, which was the only opinion he had told the council he considered essential. The ancient laws governing Ashenkin bloodlines were formally reviewed by a panel that Soren convened within the first week of their return to Ashenvail. The review took 3 weeks. At the end of it, the provisions in question were repealed unanimously, on the grounds that they had been written not for reasons of genuine safety, but by a specific faction within the founding pack, for reasons of fear and consolidation, which was not the same thing and had never been. Mireia had sat in the back of the council hall for the final session of that review. She watched the vote with her hands folded in her lap and felt something in her chest release that she had not fully understood was still held tight. She thought about her grandmother, about those dense, careful pages documenting what the old wolves knew, about a woman who had spent her life hiding the nature of her gift in plain sight because the alternative was too dangerous to contemplate. She pressed the thought into a place she could visit again. The formal announcement of the true mate bond was made at the spring assembly, before the full pack assembled in the great courtyard of Ashenvail Lodge. Soren made it himself, in the direct plain language that was his gift, without political ornamentation or strategic framing. He said that he had found his true mate, and she had accepted him, that she was Mireia of the Ashenkin bloodline, and that the pack was invited to make her acquaintance. The assembly received this with the slightly stunned quality of a group prepared by months of extraordinary events to accept extraordinary information, followed by a rising sound that was not entirely a howl and not entirely a cheer, but occupied a territory between the two that felt precisely right. Halsa arrived at Ashenvail 6 weeks after the spring assembly, having been invited by Mireia herself with the careful formality of someone who understands the difference between asking and summoning. Pell and his father traveled with her, brought along at Mireia's invitation, because she had decided that the people who had kept her alive in Dunhollow deserved to see how the story ended. The midwife assessed the lodge's healing facilities with efficient thoroughness, made several pointed observations about the organization of the medicine stores that Mireia found entirely valid, and took up temporary residence in the room beside the healing wing with the air of a woman who had decided this was where she was needed, and that settled the matter. She was right, as it turned out. The twins arrived on the last evening of spring, with the decisive timing of children who have been ready for a while and have decided that waiting for a more convenient moment is not something they intend to do. Soren was present for every minute of it, which Halsa permitted on the grounds that he was too large to remove without considerable effort, and that his presence was clearly doing something beneficial for the process. The boy arrived first, dark-haired and loud about it, arriving into the world with the confident announcement of someone who considers his presence to be significant news. His eyes, when they opened, were the amber of new autumn. The girl arrived second, quieter, looking around with an expression of focused assessment that made Halsa laugh outright. Her hair was the color of river water in the sun, and when she shifted for the first time, 30 minutes after her birth, To the complete astonishment of everyone present except Mireia, who had been half expecting it, her wolf form was the pale silver of a winter moon. Soren held his daughter first, then his son, with the careful, overwhelmed tenderness of a man discovering that a capacity he had not known he possessed was, in fact, enormous. His hands, which could bring down a rival wolf or break a siege door, cradled each child as if they were made of something more precious than anything the pack's history had ever produced, which, in his assessment, was entirely accurate. Mireia watched him from the bed where Halsa had firmly installed her, and felt the bond between them carrying his emotions the way a river carries everything it touches. The love and the relief and the profound, barely spoken gratitude for the specific shape this life had taken despite every effort made to prevent it. "You are going to be insufferably proud of them," she told him. Comprehensively, he agreed, without looking up from his daughter's face. "The pack is going to have opinions." "The pack can keep them," Mireia smiled. Outside the window of the healing room, the long spring evening light was gold on the stones of the courtyard, and from the direction of the great hall she could hear the pack beginning to gather, drawn by news that traveled through the lodge with the speed of something that every wolf in Ashenvail had been waiting for, without knowing the exact shape of what they were waiting for. Their alpha had his mate. His children had arrived. The bond that should have been completed months ago was sealed, whole, and permanent. The crisis of the winter was behind them, and the work of building what came next was ahead of them, complex and imperfect, and entirely real. Pell appeared at the doorway holding a bundle of early spring flowers assembled with more enthusiasm than precision. He had grown at least an inch since autumn. He held the flowers out to Mireia with the focused seriousness of someone who intends for a gesture to be received as significant. "Dunhollow sends its regards," he said, with a dignity that made Halsa make a quiet noise behind her hand. Mireia accepted the flowers. "Tell Dunhollow," she said, "that the debt runs the other direction." Outside, the wolves of Ashenvail lifted their voices. The sound moved across the courtyard and through the spring evening and out into the territory, carried on air that smelled of new growth and thawed earth, and the freshness that arrives when a long, difficult winter finally, completely, gives way. It was not a sound of triumph exactly. It was something older and less performative than triumph. It was the sound of a pack recognizing, without words and without ceremony, that what had been broken was whole again, that what had been threatened had endured, that the bond at the center of their world had been tested by everything a scheming, fearful, ambitious human nature could throw at it, and had come through on the other side not diminished, but deepened. Mireia listened to it from her bed in the healing room, with her children in the arms of their father and the spring light on the walls and the mark on her wrist burning for the first time, with nothing except warmth. Nothing except the plain, hard-won, completely ordinary miracle of being exactly where you are supposed to be. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this story found you at the right moment, and that whatever you are fighting for, whatever you are refusing to give up on, you carry it forward with the same certainty that some things are simply worth the cost of reaching them.